This is the Sideways Thinker podcast with me, Caroline Kay. In this series, we're going to explore some of our best known or even least known Bible stories, helping us reconnect to the West's most important foundational texts. Whether you're a seasoned Bible reader or simply Bible curious, join me to rediscover this outrageous literary collection. As Westerners, it is the air that we breathe and the ground upon which we walk, because these are the stories that literally built the West. They have nurtured, amazed, and sustained us. They have brought us right up to this moment, right here, right now. Welcome to Babel for the Bible curious. Welcome back to the third episode in our series on the Tower of Babel. This is very much a part 2 to the previous episode because there really was so much to cover. I wanted to get the actual story read out in Hebrew and to have an initial look anyway, at how that appears to us, and to just get the flavour of the rhythms and the sounds and the repetition that's going on. The other thing I want to cover in this episode is another look, slightly different, at the Hugh Wilborn book, and there's some very pertinent aspects to what he's writing that link very well with what we're trying to do here with the story of the Tower of Babel. In terms of a brief summary before we move on to those things, we have so far given a little bit of thought to how the idea of language and the same language and the same words can lead to the idea of thinking in the same way. So the Babel story does foreground, I think, the idea that thinking differently is very, very important. We also thought about the positioning of the story coming straight after Noah and just before Abraham. We're going to come back to that in more detail as we go along. We also investigated a little bit of the Hebrew, starting to really think about how the Hebrew itself is constructing part of the story. I also mentioned a few times, really, this conundrum about belief in God, and I suggested that those who find that to be quite difficult is to just think of God as a character in the story, so that you can actually benefit, I think, from the important messages that the story has for us. The other point also is about this idea of what the Bible is. It isn't really a good place if you're looking for facts. So the Bible isn't about it being a repository of facts. It's more about meaning and it's more about wisdom. So you go to the Bible for wisdom, and it's a learning process, an engagement process. You don't go to look up a fact as such, although, I suppose if you're looking for details of a particular story, that's a different thing though, isn't it? So we're going to move on now to verse 6, and we'll pick up there, and then we'll have a bit more of a discussion, and then we will go back to the Hugh Wilborn. So as we get to verse 6, it's really quite interesting because it's as though God starts thinking of the implications of what all of this is going to lead to. And he's saying if as one nation and one language, this is how they've begun to act, then nothing they propose to do will be out of their reach. I find this really interesting because if we join that up with the idea of the technology, the idea of conformity, control, thinking in one way, then that is actually as contemporary for us as it gets, because it is very like the modern day conundrum, isn't it? We have lots of technology, we use technology, all kinds of things count as technology. But the idea that we might be controlled, if you like, or have no limits over what we might get up to, that's actually quite frightening. If you think about what humans are capable of doing with technology and how dreadful it could get, there's a sort of warning here about a number of things going on, and it's it's actually so rich, this particular story, that you begin to realize that the form of the story, the sounds and the rhythms and the language used, it gets really interesting. But, this idea, if I don't stop this, then nothing they propose to do will be out of their reach. This could get out of control. And there's something here that God doesn't want. And even if you think of God merely as a character, that's fine, because this all-encompassing goodly character doesn't want for humans anything that will stop them from flourishing. He doesn't want anything that will, not that they he's not saying I don't want them to have their full potential. Nothing will be out of their reach. I must stop them because they might end up finding things out. It's not that. It's something else. It's like this could get out of control. So something needs to change. And when you think about what it is that God does to make things change, it's not really a punishment. It's something else. And this is what will lead us to some of our wider discussions about what it means to be a nation. And I'm getting ahead of myself there, just sort of throwing that in, because this is where we're going to be looking. We're going to be looking at all of these things as the series progresses. In verse 7, of course, God gets a little bit sarcastic because he mirrors the language that the humans were using. Come, let us build. A call to action. And God says, come, let us go down there, to confuse their language. I find it quite amusing to think that God thinks, oh, right, you think you're so clever, don't you? Well, I'm going to sort you out, Come, let us go down. So that the royal we comes into play here, and God goes down, and whatever it is he does then confuses the language. And that's a very interesting way of thinking about this, because obviously communication is rooted in language. It is the thing that marks us out from animals. Okay, so language is not just words for things. It's not just a tool that you pick up. It is something much more meaningful, and it is something that we inhabit rather than a tool that we pick up, use and discard at the end of the day or whatever. It isn't. It's part of us. We inhabit it. So it is language. And don't forget, of course, right at the beginning of Genesis, creation is brought into being when God speaks. So language is actually really important. We can't just do away with it, which is why it really does help in a way to just make a bit of an effort to listen to the original Hebrew, because the language is actually functioning to tell us something. And when it's translated purely into English, if that's the only way that you've ever heard the story, then there is something that's lost. You hear that phrase, it got lost in translation. Well, there's a whole pile of stuff that's getting lost in translation. And, this is the actual story of humanity's life, really, isn't it? That, we're always translating things. We never quite get 100% meaning. If you've ever tried to translate from one language into another, it's never exactly right. But here, God mirrors the language of the human beings in a slightly sarcastic way, and he makes that decision to confuse the language. One of the signifiers here is a play on words, or a sound-alike thing. So you have this word balal, which is very like Bavel, and Bavel is the Hebrew for Babel. So the B and the V are sort of interchangeable, and as they are in quite a number of languages, but certainly in Hebrew. And so you've got this word balal, which really means mixing up, a bit like, it's not destroying language, it's mixing the language. So it's a bit like when you mix ingredients for a recipe or something like that. It's mixing up rather than destroying or anything like that. And so we come to verse 8, where you have this fire fets, he scattered. And so, of course, the very thing that they didn't want, they wanted to stay put, they wanted to build their city, their very dense way of living, working together, a kind of over-harmonious kind of conformity illustrated by the idea of bricks. This fear of dispersion, well, it becomes a reality. They try to avoid it and it doesn't work. It doesn't work out like that. So in verse 9, this is where God calls the place Babel, because he had confused the language of all the earth. So all the earth is sort of biblical speak for everyone rather than all the actual earth. It's a figure of speech. It's idiomatic, if you like. And so it basically means that everyone's language was confused, and therefore the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. So you've got this all the earth meaning everyone, and then everywhere, if you like, in this particular context. God wants this, he wants people to fill the earth. This has been said before, and now he really means it. It's like, right, okay, you think this is going to save you from another flood. I've said I'm not going to do that again. I want you to replenish the earth. You can't just stay here, and you can't just all be the same. Somehow God doesn't want that, and if we really begin to dig deep and start thinking about what all of these things mean and how we can find resonance, there are some really good reasons why God wanted to disperse people and to at least have difference in language. So the Hebrew's working in a number of interesting ways, in that there's a certain kind of unity that is established. So this kind of description of everyone working together, everybody having the same language, everybody having the same words, implying thinking the same way. And so the repetition echoes this, and that kind of unity is sort of established through that repetition. And human speech is mirrored by divine speech. God, he mirrors it back. And so there is a kind of almost a kind of balanced, symmetrical structure to the way the story is actually written. And there is a sort of I suppose climax to the story is like a sound-based thing rather than a conceptual thing, in the sense that you're hearing the way things are developing, you're hearing what is the point of it, you know, the plays on words, the repetition of words, and the twist, if you like, the whole thing being about language. And Babel is not named for what it is, but rather because of what happens in that place. And the confusion that is described is a kind of mixing rather than annihilation or punishment even. It isn't a punishment. It is just a setting back of what God wanted in the first place. And this is the wider intention of human flourishing, I would argue. So my overall kind of take for this episode, really, and for the story, is that God wants the best for humans, sometimes stepping outside what is comfortable, i.e. not staying in one place and just hunkering down. Sometimes it's necessary to push the boundaries of what we're capable of so that we achieve more. And of course, that whole thing about making mistakes, that's actually the way we learn. If we don't make any mistakes, we don't learn a thing, do we? So the people of Babel were tied to one place. They had one way of doing things and one kind of labour, one language, one singular ambition. And even those bricks seem to emphasise this sort of repetitive sameness. And you could argue, and I think people have argued really well, because you can link this with the story of the Exodus, that this kind of sameness and monotony smacks of slavery. As if to signal this, of course, the Hebrew repeats words in an uncharacteristic fashion. So it mimics the boredom and the fruitlessness of this city's existence. So that repetition, that kind of mechanical thing which we mentioned before, it emphasises this sort of thing. Because normally, like you would do in English, you'd find different words. You wouldn't keep repeating the same words because it sounds awkward. And that's noticeable here if you know the Hebrew, because you think, well, normally you would have used another word there, but no, it is intentional. So we might think about this thing about oneness and togetherness. So cooperation and togetherness, you know, it's not the same thing. There's a kind of monotony and conformity that isn't healthy. So it's not that you should never work together. In fact, I think studying and worshipping together are really good things, but there needs to be a balance. So staying stuck is not a good thing. So we can't really gloss over the language thing. We can't gloss over the fact that the story is originally a Hebrew story. We've got to acknowledge, I think, that there's some magic there that we're missing if we don't actually at least try to understand what's going on, even if we can never fully inhabit the Hebrew language. And so the idea of the text in its time, this is actually quite an interesting thing. Remember that in ancient times, people experienced what we call scripture, which implies writing. People didn't have access to books and scrolls as individuals. They experienced these stories as part of an oral tradition, and that this tradition is something that is developed over time. The stories are honed and redacted, they're shaped, and of course, they weren't written in English. And so meaning is not necessarily something that is a settled thing. So we can understand the Tower of Babel's story in modern times because of the things that are going on around us. But of course, in every generation, people find different meanings and different resonances. So I mentioned very briefly how language is something that is quite unique to humans. And some people would argue, well, animals communicate, but they do. I know this, but what they don't have is language. It is very, very different. So language is structured into sentences. Language has grammatical rules. It has verbs and tenses. And this means that concepts such as the past and the present and the future, we can convey those things by using language, but an animal can't. Yes, animals do communicate, and they communicate very well at times. But what they don't have is the sophisticated level of language that enables us, for example, to build a culture, a culture of literature, a culture of art and architecture and so on. That is not what animals have. One more thought, I think, about the modern day to try and get this point across about how this conformity is so negative, and to think about this idea of language. We live in a time when we've got people who call themselves activists, okay, so whichever part of the political spectrum you want to point to there. But you will notice a tendency to bleat out slogans, and this sloganeering actually prevents thinking, okay? So people who shout slogans and repeat them over and over again, they're not actually thinking, they're just saying things and not necessarily meaning them. And I think, you might think of young people being very impressionable and easily politicized. When you hear people shouting slogans over and over again, that kind of shouting and repetition prevents thought. It's almost like a kind of hypnotic process, a repetition, an indoctrination. It's not something that actually opens up thought. And so this is something that occurs to me that we're getting a hint of in the Babel story, in the way that the story itself uses repetition, repeated words, repeated sounds, in a way that, it echoes this idea of conformity. And you've got the image of the bricks. You've got this image of hammering, maybe, repeated noises, technology. If you imagine how big a project building a tower and a city like this would be in ancient times, and you've got, an all-encompassing world of repetition and I would say quite unpleasant work. So if we think about how important it is to think, and that thinking is something that only really happens when you have difference, when you have the ability to argue with others, then you can see where I'm driving at in terms of how the story of Babel is so important. So I think now it's time to return back to our friend Hugh Wilborn and his amazing book on the bug in our thinking. And I wanted to draw your attention to a particular chapter. He has a chapter which is actually called A Babel Story. And I find it quite an interesting chapter. The whole book is very interesting. This particular chapter, I think, has a bit of a resonance with what we're actually doing here. And he begins this chapter, A Babel Story, with a bit of an anecdote about the idea of doing in-depth interviews. And he tells the story of how people, when they do these in-depth interviews, whether it's on podcasts or whether it's in psychotherapy, they actually find it very satisfying because it's not often they get the chance to just reflect or simply just stop and think about what's going on in their world, what's going on in their lives. And of course, what this does is it involves storytelling. And this is the kind of thing he keeps weaving in and out of throughout the book, that storytelling is what we do. As human beings, we tell stories, we make narratives out of the things that are going on in our lives. He also reminds us that perhaps people don't think as much as they should. So here's a little quote. This is just one standalone thing that he puts, and it's quite amusing. Thinking deeply is rather like cooking. It is enjoyable and nourishing, but if you get out of the habit, you can live without it. You could get your opinions from Pizza Hut. And I thought that was an amusing way anyway to make the point that, thinking is something that we perhaps should do more of. And we think we're thinking when we're repeating slogans or we're repeating things we've heard from other people. Now, he's drawing upon the philosopher Heidegger when he talks about that. And I think that's actually quite poignant and interesting for the generalized topic of what we're doing here with the Tower of Babel. So he also, in this chapter, moves on to writing about elephants. And I suppose we can talk about the elephant in the room. So he says, of course, many of the people who do know about the elephants disagree with each other, like the famous blind men walking through the jungle who encounter an elephant. Each one of them knows what he has really found. The one holding onto a leg knows he's found a tree. The one holding onto the trunk has found a snake. The one holding onto the ear realizes it's a fan. The one touching the flank believes it is a wall, and so on. And then he goes on to say this. There are elephants and there are woozles. Winnie the Pooh and his friend Piglet go hunting for woozles. They find their tracks and follow them. As they do so, they see more and more woozles are joining the group. Eventually, they realize they are following their own tracks round and round in circles. A woozle is a very low-quality academic paper, which nevertheless gains credibility and high status because it is repeatedly cited, and papers which cite it are cited, and on and on. The world's most famous woozle is an academic paper by John Cook et al., claiming that 97% of the world's scientists believe in dangerous man-made global warming. It is endlessly cited, although many reviews have pointed out its flaws. Most recently, David Craig re-examined it, brackets. His analysis and the original paper are worth reading, and he includes notes about it at the end of his book, end bracket. Craig shows that multiple chicaneries were used to generate the figure of 97%. The data used in the paper itself reveal that only 8.2% of the abstracts reviewed explicitly agreed with the theory of man-made global warming. On reflection, it is most peculiar that John Cook's woozle is cited at all, because consensus is irrelevant to the progress of science. Indeed, many following Popper would say, science proceeds by overturning the consensus. So many woozles, so many elephants, our room is crowded. I thought that was a really interesting section of that chapter. I think it illustrates something about this idea of repeating things. And when we talked about the idea of people chanting out slogans, and that process actually prevents somebody from thinking. There's something going on there when there's a political agenda that uses the frameworks of science to present something as true, and that our ability to discern is affected by, I think, possibly the choice many of us have made not to think, because we've got things that will do the thinking for us. And of course, we've got AI, which has its uses, But we need to be aware that if we don't keep our own brains in tip-top condition, we will lose the ability to think. And I think that's his Pizza Hut remark. You could get all your food from Pizza Hut, but perhaps it's more nourishing not to do that. Another quote that I thought was interesting. So he says, the ability to create and use abstractions is in itself neither good nor bad. It is a cognitive tool which is immensely useful in the right context. The problem, put precisely, is not abstraction, but the default prioritization of abstraction. In the contemporary ocean of incompetence, malefactors get an easy ride. If all you want is power or money, you will find politicians and academics easy to manipulate. Big tech, big pharma, and big money prosper mightily. And then this. Consider any contemporary issue which is currently being taken seriously by politicians and ask these questions. Does the issue entail belief in one or more simplistic abstractions? Does this belief minimize the importance of context? Does this belief encourage centralization? Are opinions fixed and resistant to change? Do the proponents display juvenile and unsubtle emotional states? If the answer is yes to two or more of the above, the chances are that the issue is misconceived because it is founded on an inadequate abstraction. As we have seen earlier, such issues are exacerbated because abstractions can induce hypnotic cognitive capture. And I'm just going to step out of his quote there just to say that that really does fit in with our exploration of the Tower of Babel, because it is almost as though that kind of abstraction, the hypnotic process of the repetition that we manage to deduce from the story, the bricks, the sameness, the same words, the one language, the one place, the one nameless people. You've got a kind of hypnotic thing there. You have power over people when you get them into that state. So back to the quote, foundational abstractions may be integrated into the sense of self. Foundational abstractions may distort a person's entire worldview. And then he says this, cognitive capture is not a weird, unusual phenomenon. It is normal. It is, sadly, the everyday state of many people. This is not new. There is plenty of evidence that human behaviour before the impact of literacy was far from perfect. But maybe, just maybe, cognitive capture makes it a bit worse. At that point in the chapter, he then tells the story of the Tower of Babel, slightly changing the words, which is really interesting. So moving on a few pages, he says this. There are 4 types of people. Those who know and know they know, listen to them. Those who know and don't know they know, they need to wake up. Those who don't know and know they don't know, they need to learn. Those who don't know and don't know they don't know, they are a menace. Please stop electing them to public office. He concludes his chapter with this. Gravity is required. Gravity is delivered by reality, eventually. What I took on that last quote, I often think about a phrase that kept coming into my mind, and that is this idea of a wall of reality, that eventually, whatever fantasies people indulge themselves with, they will eventually hit the wall of reality, and the longer it takes for them to face up to what's true and what's real, the worse the pain is when they hit that wall. I think one of the things this Wilborn tries to get us to understand is that we haven't always written everything down, we haven't always codified things, and that a lot of what happened in ancient times was very much about an experience. And I've alluded to that slightly when we've talked about the Tower of Babel, because in ancient times, people would have listened to that story, and they would have listened to different versions of that story. And we might come to that if we have time. Maybe, well, not in this episode, but we will have a look perhaps at the Book of Jubilees, where the story of the Tower of Babel is really quite different. It's absolutely linked directly with the story of Noah. And so there are different versions of things, and that's because each version was a performance. Each performance was an experience. And we tend not to live our lives like that. We tend to contract out a lot of what we experience, and we experience the world through screens, through our phones, our computers, our television screens, even books in a way. They are often shorthand versions of experiences. Now, this has clearly allowed a great body of knowledge to develop. So I'm not saying we should never have done that. And he's not saying that. I think what he's saying is that we need to be aware that there is a way of understanding the world because we're immersed in it. And in a sense, this is quite key, really, in many ways, to understanding the Tower of Babel, because what seems to be described, if we drill down into the story, is a top-down command experience. People are doing what they're doing because they're just units of workers. They're just like little bricks. Everything about the story is pointing to this one image. And of course, the Babel story itself points to other stories in the Bible. We're going to make those connections as we go along. So this is why I thought the Hugh Wilborn book was so interesting. It's actually a very interesting book to listen to on Audible, because you hear him telling the stories, and listening to something is quite different to sitting down and opening the book and reading. And we'll come back to what that process involves as we move through the series as well. Next time, we'll have a look at what really niggles God about this story: the city. So until then, bye for now. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Sideways Thinker podcast with the Babel series for the Bible curious, written and produced by me, Caroline Kay. Music is Stars and Laurels by Shane Ivers for Silverman Sounds. If you enjoyed this podcast, and I really hope you did, please like and subscribe and share on the usual platforms. Thank you so much.